Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. Hey gang, before we get started, I just want to give everybody a heads up. I am actually heading out on vacation, trying to make something of this crazy summer that I've had. I am headed to the heart of the Adirondacks to look for the ghost of Grace Brown. So look for a couple of best ofs next week, and I will be back right after that with some really good stuff for you. Keep sending your stories in, Uncle Josh, truescarystories@gmail.com. Looking forward to an excellent fall. And before you know it, we'll be having our annual Halloween extravaganza. Everybody sit back, relax, enjoy some true scary restaurant stories. Closing shift on a Tuesday, submitted by Les. I was 17 when this happened, back in the summer of 2021. I'm 22 now, but I still can't stand being alone in a building after the sun goes down. And I strictly don't work night shifts anywhere for any reason. I lived in a small town up in Holt County, Nebraska. It's not totally out in the middle of nowhere, but it's close enough. Out there you had long stretches of dark highway and miles of corn and pastures, and just a couple of places to eat right off US 20. I was working the closing shift at a local fast food burger joint. One of those standard corporate franchises with the bright yellow fluorescent lighting and shitty linoleum floors and the perpetual smell of fryer oil. Back then, I was just saving for a beat-up Chevy Silverado that I wanted to buy off my uncle, so I picked up every late-night closing shift that nobody else wanted. This happened on a Tuesday night. Tuesdays out in the middle of nowhere, you're usually dead. By 9 o'clock, the drive-thru was totally silent, and the main lobby closed at 8 anyway. So after 8, it was just drive-thru orders, and the rest of us scrubbing down the ice cream machine, mopping the floors, and just counting the minutes until 10. On that shift, it was just me, a 16-year-old girl named Chloe, who worked the register and drive-thru window, and our assistant manager, Marcus. Marcus was 19, acted like he was 30, but didn't actually know how to handle anything real if it hit him. He was a total fast food restaurant lifer. We could tell that even though he was only 19. Around 8:30 p.m., a gray late 90s Taurus pulled in through the drive-thru. I was in the back near the grill scraping off the grease traps, but I heard the loud hum of the muffler through the headset that we all had to wear. Chloe answered, greeted them, and then waited. It was just this long pause where nobody on the other end said anything. All I could hear was the idling engine and a soft, low thudding sound like heavy bass from a phone speaker. Chloe reached out again and said, "Hi, welcome to blank. What can I get you tonight?" And finally a guy's voice came through. It was slow, thick, and raspy, like someone who'd smoked 2 packs a day and hadn't slept in 2 days. He didn't order anything right away. He just asked, "You guys got the lobby locked up tight?" Chloe looked in the back and caught my eye. I could see that she was confused. She was young and didn't really think anything of it, just figured that this guy was a weird customer. Yeah, she said. Our lobby closes at 8. It's drive-thru only right now." "How many of you in there?" the guy asked. That's when I started to get nervous. I mean, even at 17, I knew that you don't answer a question like that. So I kind of ran over to Chloe and took the headset off her head and pressed the button. "Hey, can I take your order, sir, or are you just passing through?" I made my voice as flat and as tough as a 17-year-old could make it. There was another really long pause, and then the car slowly drove past the order speaker without ordering a thing. It rolled past our window, and I peered through the glass. The windows on the Taurus were tinted dark, but as it passed under the parking lot light, I saw 2 guys in the front seat. The passenger wasn't looking forward. His head was turned entirely toward our window, staring straight into the kitchen. He was wearing a plain gray hoodie pulled low. I couldn't see his eyes, just the bottom half of his face, which was set in a tight, pale line. They didn't take off, they just kind of idled near the edge of the property by the ditch for about 3 minutes before pulling out onto the highway. I told Marcus about it right away, and he just laughed, said it was probably some drunk guys from out of county looking for trouble or just trying to scare us. He went back into the manager's office to finish up his inventory and then just fuck around on his phone. But I couldn't shake it. Every little sound made me jump after that. The ice machine dropping ice, the timer on the fryers, and the wind rattling the back steel door. At about 9:45, 15 minutes before we were scheduled to shut down, I was sweeping the back hallway near the rear exit. That exit led out to the dumpster pad and the employee parking area. It had a thick heavy metal door with a small square wire glass window and a crash bar on the inside. Out of habit, I glanced out the little window into the dark lot, and there was the gray Taurus, parked right next to my uncle's truck, with its lights completely off. Before I could even process what I was looking at, the back door didn't just rattle, it slammed inward with a violent bang. Someone had to have taken a heavy sledge or remit a crowbar to the latch from the outside while none of us was paying attention, or maybe some idiot had left the latch unbolted after throwing out the trash earlier in the day. I still don't know for sure, but what I do know is that goddamn door flew open and hit the concrete wall with a sound like a gunshot. 2 guys came rushing in. Now, they weren't wearing classic masks or anything like you see in the movies. The first guy had a dark blue bandana wrapped tight over his nose and mouth and a black baseball cap pulled down. The second guy had a dirty white dish towel tied around his face with a rubber band. The first guy, who was the bigger of the two, was holding a black handgun. Don't ask me what kind, I'm not into guns. All I know is it looked real, heavy, and nothing like a toy. He screamed at us, "Get on the fucking floor!" But his voice was that same raspy, dead voice from the drive-thru guys an hour earlier. I let go of my broom instantly and hit the wet linoleum, flat on my stomach. My heart was pounding so hard I felt like I was going to throw up, and I heard Chloe scream from the front counter. Then I heard work boots stomping down the hallway, and the guy with the gun kicked me right in the ribs as he walked past. I don't think he was trying to break anything, but it did take the air out of my lungs. I think it was one of those don't do anything stupid kind of kicks. Then I heard him say, "Where's the manager? Where's the safe?" Marcus came out of his office. His hands already up in the air. He was shaking so hard his knees were literally knocking together. I thought that was something that only happened in cartoons. He said, "It's in the office. It's open. Just take whatever you want. Don't shoot." The guy with the bandana shoved Marcus by the back of his neck into the office, and I just laid there on the cold floor, pressed against the tile, and watching all of this from a weird angle. I could hear the second guy dragging Chloe by her arm toward the office, and she was crying and gasping for breath and trying not to make noise because every time she made any kind of sound, the guy swore at her. "Open the bottom drop box," the guy yelled from inside the office, and Marcus yelled out, "I can't, man, I can't. It's on a 15-minute delay. I can only open the top one. That's all the cash, man. It's all the cash I have. Just take it." There was this awful silence for a little bit, and then the sound of a heavy metal object hitting what I could only assume was flesh, because after that I heard a wet thud and Marcus scream out. The guy had pistol whipped him across the side of the head, and I heard Marcus drop to the floor. "Then empty the fucking top drawer, all of it, just get it in a bag." That was the raspy voice guy. I heard the clatter of the plastic register tills being emptied into some kind of bag. None of this could have taken more than 45 seconds, but it felt like the longest night of my life. I just kept my eyes glued to that office door, laying flat, praying that they would just take the money and get the hell out of there. I heard footsteps come out of the office and back towards me, and the boot stopped right next to where I was laying. At that point, I did close my eyes, and I felt the toe of a boot press firmly against the side of my face. I heard 2 words, "Look up." I looked up. I could see the guy standing over me. His eyes were bloodshot, and they were kind of yellow at the corners. There was no rush or panic in him. Everything about him seemed entirely cold. He started to kneel down and lowered the barrel of the handgun until it rested on the bridge of my nose. That is something I will never forget as long as I live. I remember it feeling freezing cold against my skin. "Listen to me carefully, boy," he said. "We know this town. We know who works here. We're getting out of here. We're leaving. But if you move off this floor before 5 minutes passes, or if I hear a fucking siren before we hit the highway, I'm coming back for you. And if the cops ever find us because of anything that you tell them, I know where you live, and I'll finish this. You fucking got it?" I tried to speak, but I couldn't. I just kind of nodded. He stared at me for another couple of seconds, then took the gun back, got back to a full stance, and then he and his buddy ran out of the back door. A second later, we heard their car engine rev and the car take off. I laid there in silence for what felt like 10 minutes. I didn't hear Marcus or Chloe moving. The only sound I could hear was Marcus kind of quietly crying in the office. I finally got up and called the police. State troopers and county deputies showed up, but by then, the guys were long gone into the Nebraska night. They never were caught. They did get the license plate of the Taurus from our video footage, but it was a stolen vehicle from Iowa. The guys had cased the building earlier that evening through the drive-thru and picked a night when they knew our town was dead and it would only be us kids working. Needless to say, I quit that job right on the spot. But to this day, whenever I'm in a restaurant or a store late at night and I hear a loud bang or a heavy door slam, my heart goes right into my stomach. I'm 17 years old again and looking up at a guy pointing a gun right at my face. Working the Bar, submitted by Kendra. Way back in 2018, I was 26 years old and working as a bartender at a local dive that was situated just along the edge of Northridge, right on the outer fringes where the suburban sprawl of Los Angeles begins to just turn into the foothills. My name is Kendra, and back then I was no stranger to handling drunk customers, or late-night regulars, or just aggressive guys who misread basic hospitality for personal interest. Yeah, I've been bartending since college. I had a number of years under my belt. But nothing of my years in that line of work could have prepared me for the slow, agonizing escalation that began the moment this middle-aged woman I'll call Brenda started frequenting my place. She was in her early 50s and had this harsh, sun-bleached tan that looked painted on, and she kind of carried herself like a predator with this confidence that immediately set my instincts on edge. At first, her behavior seemed harmless, like she was just there cruising for young guys, and flirting with customers who simply enjoyed playing the part of an older, wealthy woman pursuing this younger bartender. She would sit at the far corner of the bar where she had a clear view of my every movement, and every time she came in, she would just sip on these cheap gin fizzes, and after a while, I realized she was not there for young guys. She was there for me. Every once in a while, she'd make an inappropriate comment about my body or ask intrusive questions about my personal life. But always, and I mean always, she left absurdly large cash tips for me and me alone. By the time we got into July, she kind of changed from just being an annoying customer into this terrifying person that began to bleed into every corner of my daily existence. She rarely came in during peak weekend rush hours when the bar was obviously packed with crowd, but instead started coming in at dead hours right before closing, standing outside the front windows for minutes at a time just watching me wipe down the taps before coming inside. She started leaving these weird, unhinged handwritten notes on paper napkins detailing elaborate and disturbing fantasies about taking me away to her house in the canyons, and on 2 separate occasions, I spotted her sitting in a silver Mercedes outside my apartment building, which was nowhere near where I worked. That proved to me that she'd somehow followed me home after one of my shifts. I finally brought my concerns up to my manager, Bill, but he brushed it off as an amusing role reversal, telling me that as a young woman I couldn't possibly be any real danger from an older female. Yeah, thanks, Bill. Everything came to a head on a Thursday night in August. Everything outside was just brutally hot, and the bar was completely vacant by 1. Bill announced that he had to slip out a few minutes early to complete the night's cash deposit at the bank down on the boulevard, and that left me entirely alone to lock up the back room, restock any liquor, mop up the floors, and, just close the bar down. The moment he drove out of the gravel lot, the silence got to me, so I turned some music back on. I was getting ready to start mopping the floor when I heard the latch on the front entrance click and the door swing open. Bill hadn't locked it. And who was there? Yeah, I think you figured that out. Brenda. My heart jumped into my throat. She looked straight at me, but closed the door behind her. Then she took a second to put the deadbolt in place. I was way away from her, and I didn't even know what to do. She was dressed in this skin-tight outfit made of shiny black latex, which made this weird cracking or creaking sound every time she took a step towards me. Her eyes were wide and fixed on me, and that made me even more nervous. Before I could even reach my phone behind the register, she reached into the pocket of her jacket and flicked open an orange box cutter and slowly clicked out the blade. That really made me want to piss my pants. She got all the way over to the counter and pointed the blade directly at me and whispered that if I did not instantly throw down my apron, walk out to her car and get in and go home with her, she was going to carve my face up and ensure that I never worked around there again. I didn't know what to do. I am not lying. I was paralyzed. It felt like I was underwater during all of this. Before I could say anything, her face went into this massive rage, and she tried to jump across the counter, the latex of her sleeve squeaking loudly as she grabbed the collar of my shirt and pulled me towards her. I think if she hadn't have slipped on the wet floor, that razor blade might have actually sliced right through my face. But, as I mentioned, she did slip, right down on her side. And as her ass hit the floor, I heard the front door make a shattering noise. Richard was there, another bartender who worked another neighborhood joint a little way up the street, who just happened to be walking by our bar after his shift. He saw what was going on at the bar, tried the door, and it was locked. Without a second thought, he kicked through the lower frame of the glass door, unlocked the deadbolt, and then burst into the bar with an iron pry bar that he'd grabbed from his own back alley. He ran across the room and forcefully shoved Brenda away from me, which sent her flying. The box cutter flew out of her hand and she just laid there on the floor. Richard finally went over and kind of sat on her so she wouldn't be able to move. I immediately called the police, and miraculously for the LAPD, they didn't take too long to get out there. I did contact Bill, and that night was to be my last night at the bar. They took Brenda away, and to be honest, I have no idea what her fate was. And honestly, I don't really care. Thankfully, I moved back home to New York and am now happily working as a paralegal. I think my bartending days are over. The Bones, submitted by Colin K. Hey, Uncle Josh, I'm a no bullshit kind of guy, and I would like you to understand that before I even get into this. I've been in the restaurant business for most of my life, working for my parents. I spent 4 years at the Culinary Institute of America, learning how to manage high-stress kitchens. That, combined with my experience growing up, made it a perfect reason for me to take over my parents' restaurant. But nothing in 4 years of rigorous training and all that other experience prepares anyone for the moment your kitchen begins operating on its own accord. I took over my family's restaurant 3 years ago. It's a polished, sit-down place tucked into a historic brick building that my parents brought back in the late 90s. Growing up, I worked every position there, from dishwasher to prep cook during high school summers. It's just a classy, classic, cozy place with exposed brick, dim lighting, dark tables, and a steady stream of regulars who appreciate good food and quiet conversation. If I do say so myself, it's the kind of place you look forward to going and getting a meal. When my dad decided to retire and pass the torch to me, I was eager to modernize the menu a little bit while keeping that old-world charm that he'd worked so hard to make the place successful. My first few months rolling solo were smooth. It's just standard restaurant chaos like late seafood shipments or maybe the ice machine got broken. But around November of my first year as full owner, subtle things started going wrong in ways that didn't make any sense. At first, things were so minor that I just blamed exhaustion. A sauté pan I'd placed firmly on the prep table would end up on the floor 3 feet behind me when my back was turned. I'd set a chef's knife down, turn to grab garlic from the cooler, and then find the knife sitting perfectly centered in the middle of the butcher block, turned 180 degrees. I kept most of this stuff myself, but then those subtle things got worse. One quiet Tuesday evening after closing, my line cook Marcus and I were doing final kitchen wipe-downs, and I was leaning over the dish pit, just rinsing out the sink basins, when every single wooden spoon hung on the rack above the prep station slammed to the floor at the same time. No, it wasn't a loose hook. The rack itself remained screwed into the wall, but all 12 of those spoons hit the tiles with enough force to splinter 3 of them. Marcus looked at me, his face pale. We checked the HVAC vents. There was no draft. We just chalked it up as being an accident and went home. But 2 days later, a stack of 12-inch ceramic dinner plates resting safely in the middle of a stainless steel table didn't slide or tilt. They literally exploded outward, sending heavy porcelain shards bouncing off the far brick wall. Again, not wanting to freak anyone out, I just cleaned up the mess. But then the night shifts became suffocating. The air inside the main dining room would drop suddenly in temperature. I mean, cold enough that you could see your breath indoors while the thermostats read 70 degrees. My floor staff began complaining of a heavy metallic smell like old copper coins mixed with turned earth, and they said it would linger over the tables for 20 minutes at a time before just going away into nothing. Then the phone calls came from our regular guests, people that had been coming to this place since the 90s. The first one I received came at 11:30 at night on my personal mobile. It was from friends, Arthur and Eleanor, a retired couple who had eaten dinner in our corner booth every Friday night for over 15 years. Arthur's voice was shaking, and he asked if I had hired new night security or if anyone was staying late in the dining room after closing. I told him no, the building's always locked tight by 10:30. He went silent for a long time before explaining that as they drove past the restaurant after they went to a late movie, they looked through the big front display windows and they saw a figure standing rigidly right by the main entrance, staring out onto the street. Arthur said it was a tall man in dark, outdated clothing, but his face looked blurry, like kind of smeared like wet paint. But what terrified Arthur the most was that as their car passed, the figure didn't turn its head. It simply shifted its position instantaneously. That's the word he used. And suddenly it was standing outside on the sidewalk beside their driver's side window while the car was moving at 20 miles per hour. Then it vanished. About a week later, another longtime diner texted me a photo she'd snapped of her dessert on her table. Apparently she was going to update her Yelp review. In the glass reflection of the dark window behind her dessert plate, you could clearly see the silhouette of a woman standing directly behind her chair and bent over as if whispering into her ear. Again, the woman had no face, just this unnatural shadow where features should have been. This had all taken place while her husband was in the restroom. So, more than a little disturbed and freaked out, I went to my parents' house that Sunday. I was sitting at their kitchen table having a cup of coffee, and I flatly asked them about the building's history and whether or not they had ever experienced anything unusual during the 35 years they'd owned it. I remembered my childhood spent in those dining rooms and kitchens, and it always felt safe and warm. My dad looked at my mom, took a swig out of his coffee mug, and then shrugged. He said they never saw or heard a single odd thing. No strange noises, no moving objects, nothing. As far as they were concerned, it was just a solid 19th century commercial building with good bones. Ha, pun intended. I'll get to that. So I left my old house feeling isolated and wondering if I was losing my mind under the pressure of running the business by myself. By late winter, the poltergeist activity escalated into full-blown apparitions that was leaving my staff terrified. They'd started to notice all the things that I was noticing too by this time. Most of them stayed, only a couple left. One night around midnight, after locking up the front doors, my head server Sarah went back to the service station to pull receipts. She said she heard clear, heavy footsteps walking across the hardwood floor of the main dining room, and thinking I'd walked back from the office, she looked up and spoke, but then stopped. Standing in the center of the room was a figure. A tall, gaunt man wearing dirty trousers and a faded cloth jacket. His back was to her, and she just froze, unable to even breathe, as the man slowly turned around. Just before she screamed, she noticed that he had no eyes, just dark, hollow sockets, and his lower jaw was hanging down at this weird, dislocated kind of angle. That's the way she described it. She then said he took 3 deliberate steps towards her without making a sound on the floorboards before his entire body dissolved into a wisp of black smoke. And that's when she screamed and dropped her notepad and ran out the back door. She was one of the ones that quit. Things went on, and things finally reached a boiling point in early spring. I was down in the basement prep area alone around 1 a.m. restocking wine crates. Now, the basement of this place is huge, and half of it had concrete floors and bright fluorescent lighting where we kept the walk-in coolers and dry storage, but the back portion was an old, unfinished earth floor cellar with exposed fieldstone walls. I was just working away and pulled a case of Pinot Noir. The overhead lights flickered once and then died, which plunged me into pitch blackness. I pulled out my phone and turned its flashlight on, and as the beam cut through the dark, I heard heavy, wet breathing coming from that unfinished side of the cellar. That's when the beam of light caught movement near the stone wall. And standing there in the dirt, I swear to God, was a woman wearing a ragged, discolored dress. Her hair was all matted together and hung over her head, but through the strands I could see skin that was like gray and completely lifeless. While I stood there, terrified, she slowly raised one thin arm and pointed directly at the dirt floor beneath her feet. Then, with a sound that I can only say sounded like wet paper tearing, she just opened her mouth and vanished. I turned and sprinted up the wooden basement stairs so fast I bruised my knees on the steps, slammed the heavy metal door behind me, and then locked it. A million things were going wrong. I had staff quitting, customers were getting weirded out, and some things started going seriously wrong. I've already mentioned the building's climate and storage issues. I was hoping new equipment might somehow solve the heavy atmosphere downstairs, and maybe change everything for the better. I still couldn't explain what was happening, but I was trying to just make changes that I thought would fix things. I booked a crew of commercial contractors in April to tear out the old and failing walk-in refrigeration units in the basement and pour new concrete pads. On the second day of demo, the crew chief, a rough construction guy named Dave, whom I'd known for years, came up the basement stairs and knocked on my office door. I opened it, and he was wiping dirt off his hands with a rag, and he asked me to come downstairs to look at something. So I followed him down, back to the unfinished back corner where they'd been digging out dirt and broken brick to clear space for new drainage lines. Dave pointed his flashlight into a shallow trench, and lying in that packed clay was a long, yellowed bone, heavy and thick at the joints. It was unmistakable to me and anyone else who saw it. It was a human femur. I went upstairs and called the police immediately. Within 45 minutes, 2 patrol cars and an investigator arrived. They cordoned off the basement and brought in some forensic techs with some shovels and small trowels, and as they carefully excavated further into the dirt floor over the next 3 hours, they unearthed a second bone resting 8 inches deeper in the earth. This time it was a tibia. Both bones had jagged marks near the end joints, consistent with what I was told were deliberate cuts or trauma. Well, I lost a few days of work. I had to close the restaurant down while the police launched a full investigation, treating the cellar as a historic crime scene. They dug up most of the entire earth floor over the course of 3 days and went through tons of soil. They even brought in ground-penetrating radar. But, other than those 2 bones, they didn't find any other remains. No clothing, no personal effects, just the bones. Carbon testing and initial forensic assessment suggested the bones had been buried in that dirt for anywhere between 50 and 80 years, long before my family ever bought the property, and back when the building served as a storage house and butcher shop. After 2 weeks of inquiries, the detectives called to inform me that without any more remains or identifiable DNA, they would consider the case cold. The bones were logged into the county coroner's evidence vault, and that was it. But the day those 2 bones were packed into paper bags and carried up the basement stairs by those guys, an overwhelming sense of stillness washed over the building. I'm not lying, it was like it was instant. The heavy metallic smell that had plagued the dining room vanished. The unnatural temperature shifts completely dropped. Over the next 6 months, not a single plate moved on its own, and no one heard any footsteps on the empty floors. And better yet, no distorted figures appeared in the windows or anywhere else in the building. Operations returned completely normal, back to our quiet routine with lots of great people and lots of great food. I still work about 60 hours a week in that kitchen. I cook steaks, I manage the prep lists, and I talk with our regulars in the front dining room every single night. But sometimes late at night when I'm there and no one else is, I find myself just kind of standing there, ready to turn off the lights. I also find myself moving to stand at the top of the basement stairs and look down there in the dark. I wonder about the bones. Were they the remains of one person or 2 different victims who met a violent end in that cellar decades ago? Was it the entity that I saw, pointing at the floor trying to warn us, or was it demanding to be found? My mind races about what could have happened. Was there a murder? Was there a dismembered body? Were they scattering the parts across different properties, leaving only 2 bones to me? I don't know. I'm happy that the restaurant went back to normal. It's been great. But part of me worries that maybe by taking those bones away, we didn't really resolve anything. We just disturbed something even more. But I'm a God-fearing man, and I pray every single night that whatever was down there is gone for good, and I hope that they've found peace. Petey, submitted by Rocco. My name is Rocco, and I worked at the King of Burgers, if you know what I mean, back in the 90s. I'd worked with some very odd people back then, but nobody was as disturbing as this guy I'm going to call Peter. Well, Petey. The first thing that he told us when he was hired was that he didn't like being called Peter. He wanted everyone to call him Petey. I remember him saying it with this huge grin while staring into my face. Peter is my government name. Petey is who I really am. At the time, I just laughed. Yeah, another goofball. Petey was probably in his early 20s, although there was something about him that made him seem older. He had this really kind of gross gray complexion, really messy hair, and eyes that always seemed a little too wide open, and he rarely blinked. He had a habit of standing completely still while other people were talking and just stared at them without saying anything. And then suddenly, without warning, say something completely bizarre in the same cheerful voice somebody might use to tell you if their fries were ready. One morning, we were getting the restaurant ready to open, and Petey suddenly said, "I wonder what it would feel like if somebody pulled your fingernails off one at a time." I was the only one standing there. I didn't say anything. He just smiled at me and went back to wiping down the tables. And that became a pattern. Every few days, Petey would announce something that made everyone uncomfortable. Once while we were prepping food, he said, "You know, if you put somebody in the freezer, they don't die right away. They stay alive for a while." Another time, he was stocking cups and stuff and casually announced, "You know, if I ever disappear, don't look for me. You'll only find the people I left behind." And then he would laugh. I certainly didn't, and as far as I can remember, nobody else ever laughed at the things that he said. The strangest thing, though, was that he never seemed angry when he said this stuff. He was always happy, bordering on excitement. He would just smile like he was telling a joke that only he understood, and a couple of my other employees complained to our manager, but nothing happened. And eventually we found out why. Petey was the manager's nephew. So we figured, that explains everything. Whenever anyone said Petey was making them uncomfortable, our manager would shrug and tell us that he was harmless. He's just weird. Give the kid a chance. One of the girls who worked the register finally told him that she was afraid to be alone with Petey. The manager just laughed it off and said, he wouldn't hurt a fly. But Petey overheard him, and my coworker said that when she looked at Petey, he said, "Yeah, not a fly." And then he had his weird smile. As the months went on, Petey got stranger. He started talking to the food equipment when he thought nobody was listening. I caught him whispering to the broiler one night. I had asked for a transfer to work nights, and thinking I was getting away from Petey was short-lived. Petey got switched to this shift too, so I was stuck with him. Anyway, the night I caught him whispering to the broiler, I asked him what he was doing, and he looked at me and he said, "It tells me when someone's lying." I still don't know what that was supposed to mean. He also started making little sculptures out of ketchup packets and toothpicks and leaving them around the kitchen. They looked like tiny people hanging from something. Whenever I saw them, I'd throw them away, but he would just make new ones. One night, he was cleaning the fryer area while we were wrapping up. I was working on the broiler. We would occasionally have to stop doing what we were doing and fulfill orders, because we were still open until 11 o'clock. But as everybody else was doing their thing and the fryer was bubbling away, Petey was strangely quiet. And then I heard him say out loud, "I wonder." I turned around. He was staring into the fryer, and I told him, "Petey, don't do anything stupid." He looked at me and smiled. Then he put his hand into the fryer. For half a second, I honestly didn't understand what I was seeing. And then I thought maybe he dropped something in there and was trying to retrieve it. But he pushed his arm farther in, and I yelled out, "Jesus Christ, Petey, no!" There was only one other guy, my friend Keith, back in the kitchen. He just stood there. He didn't even react. But the craziest thing was Petey didn't scream. No cry, no crazy movements. He just stood there with his arm in the fryer, staring straight ahead as if he were waiting for something. Keith finally broke out of his spell and yelled for our shift lead, and one of the girls up front screaming that we needed to call 911. And still, Petey didn't make a sound. I moved over to him as fast as I could, and I could see that his skin was beginning to blister and peel from the heat, and the smell hit me as I got closer. That's something I'll never forget. I still couldn't believe he was conscious and standing there calmly. When I finally got to him, I grabbed him by the shoulder and yelled, "Get your fucking arm out of there!" And he looked at me and quietly said, "It's okay." I grabbed him with both hands and pulled him as hard as I could, and he resisted for a second, almost like he wanted to keep it there. And finally, I yanked him backward and he stumbled away from the fryer, and he looked down at his arm, then looked up at me and smiled. Thank God, the ambulance arrived within minutes. Paramedics came rushing in and started treating him, and they looked shocked by how calm he was. He should have been screaming in pain, but he never made a noise. Not even when they wrapped up his arm, and not when they moved him onto a stretcher, and not even when they loaded him into the ambulance. But as they carried him out, they wheeled him past all of us, and he just smiled at us and gave us a wave. That was the last time I ever saw Petey in person. About a week later, a card arrived at the restaurant, a birthday card. Nobody had a birthday that we knew of, so our manager opened it, and inside was a handwritten message from Petey. It said a number of things, but one of the lines was addressed directly to me, and it said, "Thanks for stopping me. When I get out of here, I'm going to burn the whole place down for you." There was no joke after that, no explanation. That was the last sentence. We all looked at our manager, and he just took the card, folded it, and put it in his pocket and told us to get back to work. And nobody ever talked about Petey again. Well, we certainly did outside of the walls of the King of Burgers, but never inside. Petey never came back to the restaurant, and as far as I know, none of us ever saw him after that. Our manager never told us where he went and whether he'd been released from the hospital or whether he'd gotten into trouble over what had happened. If anybody ever brought his name up, our manager would simply say, "Forget about it." Eventually, like in all fast food jobs, people quit and went different ways. I was headed off to college, and actually the restaurant changed managers not long after. Many years have passed, obviously. But every once in a while, I think about Petey standing beside that fryer, completely calm while everybody else was panicking around him. And I think about the way he looked at me when I pulled him away from it. I wonder where he is now, and I wonder if he's even alive. I wonder if he's still the same strange guy who used to make those awful announcements in the kitchen to no one. I wonder if he's still the same strange person who said all those weird things to us back in the day. Serial Rapist and Killer, submitted by Anonymous. I'm sending you this story because I'm sure you're familiar with this case, Uncle Jay. This happened right here in your hometown. I've never really told anybody about this, but it came up in conversation a couple of weeks ago, and I thought maybe I'll share my story. So here goes. Once upon a time, I was working a dinner shift at a restaurant called Soleil in Williamsville, New York, just outside of Buffalo. This was in January of 2007, and I still remember the night this guy walked through the door with his wife. At the time, I had no idea I was serving a guy who had become the center of one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in Western New York. The guy looked completely ordinary. He wasn't loud, he didn't say anything crazy, and there was nothing about him that made me think twice when I brought his food and drinks to the table. I certainly didn't know that investigators had been hunting the man known as the bike path rapist for more than 2 decades. But on this evening, the whole thing happened because police had finally gotten a break in the cold case investigation they were working. A tip had connected this man to an old 1981 rape investigation, and detectives began looking much more closely as a guy that we would finally know as Altimio Sanchez. So, back to that January night, the 13th to be exact, Sanchez and his wife came to Soleil for dinner. Unbeknownst to us, undercover detectives were waiting for an opportunity to obtain his DNA without alerting him. They were in the restaurant that night. None of us knew. After Sanchez finished eating, one of them secretly collected items from his table, including silverware, a glass, and a napkin. I later learned that one of the detectives went up to our manager and showed him his badge and asked the restaurant to not clear the table because now it was part of a criminal investigation. I remember the strange feeling in the restaurant that night as we closed. Nobody was running around and fooling around. There was just this quiet seriousness amongst everybody. We all knew something important was happening, but we didn't really know exactly what. To me, the guy was just another customer who'd come in for dinner, and I guess that's the part that really bothers me. I mean, looking back, I wonder how many people that night had no idea they were sitting only a few feet away from a guy who the police believed was responsible for years and years of terror. I'm going to pull some of this stuff from the internet to kind of round out the story for everyone, if they're not familiar with this case. The DNA they got was sent off for testing, and investigators got the answer they'd been waiting for. The samples from our restaurant matched DNA recovered from crime scenes connected to the bike path rapist. police arrested Altemio Sanchez a couple of days later, and investigators eventually tied him to the murders of Linda Yalem in 1990, Ma Jane Mazer in 1992, and Joan Diver in 2006. But what happened afterward was even harder to think about. What happened afterwards was like right out of a Law and Order. Sanchez pleaded guilty to 3 counts of second-degree murder, and he admitted to strangling each of those 3 women that I've already mentioned. He was sentenced to 75 years to life in prison, and prosecutors and investigators also, though, believed he had raped numerous other women over the years, but many of those crimes couldn't be prosecuted because of statutes of limitations and so on. This all happened a long time ago, and I think about the ordinary restaurant that I worked in, the plates being cleared and the conversations happening all around us, and all the while sitting at a table quietly while detectives secretly collected evidence that finally would take him down. I was there. At that time, it was just another night at work, but it didn't take me too long to realize I was there for one of the moments when a decades-old nightmare finally started coming to an end. Uncle Josh note. Yes, I'm very familiar with this case, and Soleil was actually one of my favorite restaurants, and I have sat at the Altemio Sanchez booth more than 1 or 2 times. Sadly, the owners, I can't remember what, I think they moved the location to downtown Buffalo, and I heard it just kind of went downhill. I stopped going, but I met a lot of really cool people there. As a matter of fact, I've shared the music of my friend Bob Malucci. You'd have to go back in the episodes to hear some of his really, really good guitar playing and singing. I used to go see Bob at Soleil. He used to be in a really cool quartet that played there a lot. But yeah, I have not thought of Altemio Sanchez in a long, long time. I know they tied him to a lot of that stuff that happened on the bike path. And guys, all I can tell you, in Western New York, that was a pretty scary time. It just didn't seem to end, and the cops never seemed to be able to find him. But they did at Soleil Restaurant right there in Williamsville, New York. Crazy, crazy stuff. I appreciate you sending that in. I hadn't thought of that in a very long time. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode. If you have a true scary story of any nature that you'd like me to narrate, email it to unclejosh.truescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. If you're catching this on YouTube and you like what you heard and saw, why not give the video a thumbs up, share it with a friend, leave a comment. I'd love to know what you thought of the stories. It's all free and it all helps out with the algorithms, so I appreciate it. Follow me on social media, and if you'd like to take your support a step further, find a link to my Patreon page in the description, and consider getting some Uncle Josh and Campfire Crew merchandise. A link to my TeePublic storefront is also in the description. Everyone, be excellent to each other, and until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything: a ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.